Our agenda for today is to take a deep dive and look at two success stories. We will hear from two individuals who are involved in successful efforts to create long-term housing affordability in their communities. Each used different strategies, and each provided a range of lessons from which we can learn. One noteworthy consistency between these stories and ours, though, is the recognition among key constituencies that achieving their goals required working together. In this respect, and in a number of others, the stories that each of our speakers will tell resonate with Brookline's story. Our moderator in this part of the discussion is Wendell Joseph. Wendell is an urban planner with a passion and a desire to help facilitate the growth and well-being of cities and communities by providing thoughtful and practical solutions to complex urban and social issues.
Thank you very much, Rashmi. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be part of today's discussion. And so that's why we're here today, right? Is to learn from two different communities who are engaging in different strategies for their respective communities to facilitate affordable housing or housing affordability in general. And we want to figure out, well, what can we learn from these case studies that can be of value to Brookline today. So with that, I would like to introduce to you George Proakis, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development in Somerville, Mass. George currently facilitates implementation of the Summer Vision City Plan, which focuses on topics as varied as zoning, urban design, stormwater recharge, family housing, and backyard chickens.
Thank you, Wendell, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm going to give a little bit of a perspective on what we're doing in Somerville. And I think that it's worth noting to start because as we look at communities, we all have similarities and differences. And I'm hoping that despite the differences between Somerville and Brookline, some of the similarities will allow us to have a perspective where we can compare notes and share some of the things that may be relevant to the challenges that Brookline has today. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview on Brookline and Somerville, some of the regional challenges, talk about three projects we're working on in Somerville and how they all tie together in terms of looking at housing affordability, and housing opportunity in our region and in Brookline in particular. Our communities do indeed have a lot in common. I think one of the more specific things we have in common in the very near future is when the Green Line extension is complete to Tufts University, and hopefully someday from beyond, it will link us directly on a single transit line, which also will bring 85% of Somerville from 15% not long ago to 85% of Somerville being within a half-mile walk of a rail station. One of the other challenges to Somerville is, unlike our neighbor to the south, Cambridge, which seems to have a lot of more commercial growth, one of our challenges financially and fiscally has been that we have been dependent upon a residential character, single, two, and three family homes, which requires us to both manage our tax base very carefully and ensure that new growth meets both commercial and residential needs and helps us grow in a way that makes sense for our community. But we have a lot in common: strong, walkable neighborhoods, the Green Line, and we also have a series of corridors with high-capacity bus lines. We're trying to make those buses faster and more efficient in Somerville all the time, but they provide a substantial transit link. I think in many ways our leadership, the strength of our municipal planning offices, and our regional affordability challenges are also very, very similar. So the Metro Mayors Coalition includes the mayors and city managers and town managers of the 15 communities closest into the Boston inner core, including Brookline, all connected by transit, and have focused on this issue that sale prices and rents are amongst the highest of any large metropolitan area in the country. Since 2010, the 15 cities and towns have added 110,000 residents, 148,000 jobs, and only 32,500 housing units. The Metro Mayors Coalition and MAPC see a need to add 185,000 housing units between 2015 and 2030 to meet demand and reduce or at least stabilize housing costs. A very significant challenge, but one that we can work on best all together. I want to share three strategies we've been using in Somerville: Summer Vision, our comprehensive plan; Somerville by Design, which is our neighborhood and corridor plans; and our zoning work. Summer Vision is the citywide comprehensive plan, which we are actually now completing it. But one of the advantages around comprehensive planning and any planning strategy is the opportunity to bring the community together, to have a conversation about where things are going, to look at both the physical design and the opportunities throughout the community. The key issue is to address how to achieve our community's values. And in Somerville, we spent a lot of time on this value statement, and even as we've gone into updating our plan, the values have remained essentially the same, about celebrating diversity, fostering community, investing in an economic base, promoting accessibility, building a sustainable future, and committing to innovation. And staying focused on those values has allowed us to be able to achieve goals as we address housing that make sure that we remain focused where we need to be. We also put together a set of pretty aggressive numbers on where we want to be, including developing 6,000 new housing units over 20 years, including 20% of those being permanently affordable. And we're meeting or exceeding those goals, but it's also balanced around job goals and open space goals and transit goals. And a map that clarifies where and how we want to do this. In our neighborhoods, the green area, we're mainly conserving the character of those neighborhoods. We are focused on the idea that within those areas, we will have more maybe accessory dwelling units or additional units, but not substantial change to its character. In those sort of yellow-orange areas, which are old industrial areas, you can do substantial, really intense development. But where I want to focus my energy today really is in the blue areas, the corridors, the squares, the T-stations, the areas that have a lot of consistency to the character that we see in many areas of the community in Brookline. In specific neighborhoods, we went into doing neighborhood planning. I want to share 3 of those really quickly with you. And on these, we really focused on the idea that we were moving away from the old style of planning where we were kind of planning out our strategy in the office, sharing it with the community, and then having everybody complain about it. What I call decide, announce, defend, replacing it with a process where we've worked from the ground up with the community on outreach and dialogue and deciding together and implementing the plan. We did these for neighborhood plan areas. We brought people together in the community, did a lot of design and drawing work to try to figure out what we wanted to do. We've come up with a number of these little station area plans for neighborhoods around future Green Line stations. Lowell Street being near Magoon Square, kind of a very subtle little plan to take industrial buildings and turn them into or replace them. They were kind of older, out of beyond their useful life, and figure out what to do. We did one little plan here where we were going to replace just a couple of buildings, and this has worked remarkably well. This development area has developed almost exactly according to plan. Essentially, 3-story buildings. Little commercial in one spot, mainly residential. Developer came in and built almost exactly what we drew in the neighborhood plan, and it's been very well supported. Winter Hill, which is the neighborhood where we had this building, we also have a vacant Star Market site nearby. I've had a lot of discussion with the community about how to build that out to include green space and development and address parking needs. We've put together a plan. We have not yet had something happen there, but we have community support and a community group that's advocating to try to get that plan done. Gilman Square, probably one of our most interesting outcomes. This was one of our earliest plans, and we actually planned a 4-story character neighborhood with essentially 5 development sites right around a transit station, and really something that we thought at 4 stories was the right mix. We've got this one gas station site, which is right in the middle of the community. But what's happened since then is a group of neighbors has actually formed and has actually been advocating for more development. They want the development up on the T station to be taller so they can get more green space, and they wanted the development at the gas station. Developer came in with a 6-story building. The neighborhood group actually became supportive of it. And for the first time that I've ever seen in my time working in planning, which is about 18 years at this point, we actually had a neighborhood group on their own file a request to upzone a neighborhood from 4 stories to 6 because they actually wanted more development there. So we're now moving forward to get that work done. Zoning is a key to success in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes, people look at zoning. I like to say the 2 scariest words for town meetings sometimes are change and zoning, and you put the 2 of them together, and sometimes people shy away from trying. But I think that it is worthwhile to take those 2 things and bring them together. When we did Summer Vision, and I think you'll see this when you do housing planning as well, you may find that a lot of your goals relate to issues that can be solved through zoning. So we spent many years working on a zoning overhaul. I won't necessarily say communities need to replace their entire code, but it worked well for us in Somerville past December, and built neighborhood zoning districts based upon the character of the community. So we have a neighborhood residence district, which is our 2 and 3 family house district, pretty typical for Somerville. But we also have an urban residence district, which is designed for those missing middle housing types, the 4plexes, the 6plexes, the small apartment buildings, and then various mid-rise districts that allow for commercial or residential or first floor retail or other different housing types, that being a 3-story district, this being a 4-story district. And for each of those sort of very clear, delineated, basically a form-based strategy for building types to establish. So this is how to build a 4-story building that can be mixed use with first floor retail and all of the provisions that go with it. A simplified use table. And then the beauty of doing new zoning was the capacity to be able to layer into offering. As you offer new capacity to build, you can offer opportunity and the things you want from development to produce in order to meet your values and meet your goals. So 20% inclusionary affordable housing, a mobility management strategy that is based more on managing parking rather than requiring parking. So wanting to get people out of their cars, this whole mobility management strategy to promote the use of other forms of travel are more important than parking requirements that we reduced or eliminated in most of our districts. This green score concept, which basically ensures that the quality of our landscape is high, sustainable development strategies about green buildings and green roofs and heat islands and environmental performance that we intertwined with the code, where basically if you are seeking more development, you're going to do it, but you're going to do it in consistency, do it in a way that is consistent with our community values coming from Summer Vision. So I think the key here is that it's been over a decade that we have worked in Mayor Curtatoni's administration to bring elected officials, municipal staff, the development community, and a lot of organizations and advocates together to try to find common ground. The outcome of these community planning strategies have been that our neighborhood nodes and corridors can be developed in line with community needs. We can meet that missing middle. You know, we're doing the high rises in places like Assembly Square, but it's most interesting and challenging in those neighborhoods where you're trying to do those 3, 4, 5-story buildings, and we're finding ways to get that done. We're meeting regional needs. We're balancing mixed uses. I think one of the most significant outcomes of all of our planning efforts is when we dropped ourselves into a pretty significant recession this year. We found ourselves also in a year where we're getting $10 million of new tax growth in the community that balanced the loss of a lot of our meals and hotel tax and put us in a position where we made it through this budget year without furloughs or layoffs because of the way we've been able to position that new growth. I think the key for us on the zoning front is that upzoning plus value capture, capturing some of the value of that increase in zoning, allows us to achieve both new housing and benefits to the community. And I think that's the significant opportunity that we had. Those benefits being making sure we have more affordability, making sure we have more opportunity, making sure we have more sustainability. And a lot of people call that value capture. Capture the cash, get it in the form of linkage, get it in the form of affordable housing. But I want to change that title a little bit from value capture to values capture, that we're actually capturing our values themselves. That sustainability and that diversity are actually part of the values of what we're trying to achieve. So that's the basic introduction of what I have to share today. And Wendell, I'm happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, George, for sharing us a bit of what Somerville has been up to for the past 10 years. I think one of the things that stands out is how it sounds like you guys have been tackling these issues from a number of different fronts. You mentioned a quick question I'd like to ask before I switch to questions from the audience is I liked how you talked about the old way of planning versus what you guys are trying to do through Somerville Design. And it's interesting because one of the things I've thought a lot about and have mentioned is, if you want to do something different, you have to do it differently. But it seems like you guys realize that, hey, we might need to shift our approach a little bit and engage in a kind of planning process that, one may call, grassroots or community driven. I guess my question then is, were there some things that came up through those processes that you were not expecting? There
are a few things that have happened that I'd say I was not expecting. since we finished some of those plans, we have found that more and more people have been advocating for us to do more than we actually put in the plan. That was completely unexpected. One of our largest plans, Union Square, I think had the most unexpected things happen because our Community Development Corporation organized a group of advocates that really pushed us on community benefits. The Union Square plan has a 50-page introduction to it about equity, and we did not set out to do that in our planning effort. We did that because the community came to us and demanded that, okay, well, we're okay with you doing more here, but we want to make sure that our small businesses are protected. We want to make sure that we address issues of how we're going to do affordable housing in these circumstances above and beyond the inclusionary. So we spent a lot of time working on that, and that shifted our plan effort significantly. Our Somerville by design still leads from design, but it has much more of an equity component in it in our most recent plans than in our earliest ones because of that community conversation.
Thank you very much, George. So we'll take a moment now to switch over to Yanni Flizrin, who co-founded Neighbors for More Neighbors, the group that led the grassroots support of Minneapolis's nationally acclaimed comprehensive plan that was passed in 2018. Previously, Yanni led a statewide affordable housing initiative that changed policy to ensure that all subsidized homes meet healthy and green standards. Yanni, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you to Building a Better Brookline for the opportunity to share our Neighbors for More Neighbors story. We at Neighbors for More Neighbors start with housing as a human right, and we don't have enough homes. And so if we care about people, we need to build enough homes that everyone can find one. We need them at every level, so people who can afford more expensive homes aren't crowding out lower wealth people from our communities. And in progressive cities, like mine and like yours, history shows that we've designed our policies to keep people out. And so while today we say we want a different result, those policies are still in place. Now, we also need complete neighborhoods that have all of the pieces that a healthy community needs. That's a balance of a variety of housing, green spaces, and businesses that create a human scale economy where people can flourish. Incomplete neighborhoods, places that lack shops and cafes and walkable streets, they leave us isolated and they take dollars out of our community. As the climate continues to change, complete neighborhoods allow us to be better stewards of our resources and create a brighter future for the kids that we love. Now, I am here today because I'm an advocate, one of the co-founders and organizers who volunteers too many hours with Neighbors for More Neighbors. I've also been an affordable housing professional for 20 years. And in my experience, the hard part is not what to do, but the politics of how to get it done. So in Minneapolis, I worked with a big crew of volunteers to change the rules so that we can skip the expensive, time-consuming housing supply blocking battles and just get permission to build more homes. So we focus on ending exclusionary policies that allow wealthier, whiter neighborhoods to avoid making space for more neighbors. I'm here because we are part of that how. In Minneapolis, we dove into those messy politics, and together with our allies, we did a thing. So Minneapolis has legalized small apartments anywhere in our city through our comprehensive plan, which is called Minneapolis 2040. It's a 20-year commitment, a work plan for every policy and action that the city of Minneapolis will touch. It's transportation, economic development, housing, climate, racial justice, and much more. So I'm going to tell you the story of how. You face the same and honestly much more extreme housing shortage that we face. So to do this change, we had to make two things that are invisible visible. We had to daylight our racist history and the remaining impacts from that history. And we had to highlight that there's political will to create a different future. So what about that history and what does it mean today? White Americans generally, and white Minneapolitans in particular, don't know our racist segregationist history. So that's where a particular project, Mapping Prejudice, based at the University of Minnesota, where that comes in. They engaged about 3,000 volunteers, and Minneapolis liberals, we know how to volunteer. We all combed through about 180,000 historic documents, uncovering the history of how Minneapolis became segregated. Those volunteers were searching for racial covenants, and we found about 30,000. Now, thinking about that history, 110 years ago, Minneapolis was not segregated. That ugly part of our story starts after an African-American couple, Madison and Amy Jackson, bought a house in a neighborhood called Prospect Park. Soon after, they helped their friend, William H. Simpson, who was also African-American, build a house nearby. This was in 1909, and a crowd of more than 100 showed up to protest their new neighbors in a conflict that the local paper headlined "A Race War in Prospect Park." In Minneapolis, the first racially restrictive deed appeared 1 year later in 1910. The deed in that transaction contained what would become a common restriction. It said that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Covenants created demographic patterns that remain in Minneapolis today. Residential segregation reinforces all the other disparities in employment, education, health, and much more. Mapping Prejudice created this slide, or this map. It's animated on their website that shows how these deeds sprouted up and spread across the city and the county. Their workshops also point out how, after the Minnesota State Legislature prohibited their use in 1953, the city of Minneapolis stepped in with exclusionary zoning for wealthy white neighborhoods. That zoning is largely in place today. Images like this map and being an active part of the research process has prompted many white Minneapolitans to reflect on how, while we didn't create the system, we seem to benefit from the system. But you do have to make this invisible history visible. People don't know about racially restrictive deeds, or that zoning, and single family zoning in particular, is systematically exclusionary until you connect the dots. In the last few years, several groups unhid the reality of what Minneapolis renters face. I'm going to highlight Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or IX. They organize some of the most vulnerable tenants in our city, often immigrants with or without papers and very low incomes. On the left, Vanessa del Campo Chacon told her story to MinPost. Once a teacher pointed out to her that her daughter never crawled, and Vanessa realized it was because she felt anxious about leaving her on the floor because of the mice and insects. On the right, Timothy Brown told his story to Shelter Force. He said, "My house isn't weatherproofed for the winter, which is unbearably cold in Minneapolis. Last year, I lived through the entire winter without heat because my landlord refuses to fix the house and the heating system." Stories like these made tenants' rights and affordable housing a central theme in our 2017 city elections. Housing stable renters and people with fixed rate mortgages, we are insulated from what most low-income renters face. Without IX telling these stories, most Minneapolitans can't imagine what our neighbors face. Now, in Minneapolis, we are constantly fed the story of our exceptionalism. We're near the top in all the lists. We have the best park system, the best biking city. We're also at the top of the list of cities with the biggest racial disparities. So in one example, 4 in 5 white families owns their homes, but only 1 in 4 Black families do. In the Minneapolis 2040 draft, planners connected the dots of how historic segregation created racial housing disparities today. They used a racial disparity frame for every topic in the plan, but I'm here to share and to talk about our abundant housing plan today, so I'm going to focus on that. But I want you to know it didn't stop with housing. It is in every single part of the plan. This plan was a step toward dismantling exclusionary zoning. The call to action in the 2040 draft primed the engagement process to make something else that is typically invisible visible. A crew of people came out to defend single-family zoned neighborhoods. They distributed apocalyptic red signs like this one. A couple of local social media celebrities applied their humor and skill to letting people know what was happening. Wedge Live is by John Edwards, and he offered well-researched tweets and blogs about anti-2040 organizing all year. One highlight was reporting that the anti-bulldozing legal battle was run by a guy who bulldozed his own house to build a bigger house. Ryan Johnson, our other local hero, he organized volunteers who biked every single block of the city of Minneapolis to locate those red "Don't Bulldoze Our Neighborhood" signs. Then he mapped the signs along with property value data. On the left, the map is the redlining map with where the signs are. And on the right, you see the property values with where the red signs were. His headline read, "High property wealth and homeownership is the connecting thread among those strongly opposed to the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan." It's no coincidence that John and Ryan are the same two people who came up with the name Neighbors for More Neighbors. Now, spotlighting our history and the exclusionary impact of our history and the structural racism that maintains white wealth, that's one step. And while it sets us up for success, it doesn't dismantle exclusionary zoning policies or eliminate racial disparities. In the US, land use is locally controlled and it's political. So to legalize building abundant homes, we have to make the political support for change visible too. We need elected officials, residents, and municipal staff to play their part if we want to end policies that harm people and create a different future. We've built the political will to do that in Minneapolis, but we had to do our work to make that visible too. So how do we do that? First, city staff are deeply committed to ending racial disparities. And that's why the planning staff set up the conversation by naming a problem with civic engagement. Historically, people of color and indigenous communities, renters, and people from low-income backgrounds have been underrepresented in civic processes. Then those planners designed to counteract that. They started their engagement by centering the voices of those underrepresented folks. They hosted safer spaces like invitation-only Somali focus groups for Somali entrepreneurs and others. The themes from those groups framed up the larger plan before they hosted open public events. At the open events, they reminded us of our values. They told us the challenges we face, and they invited our ideas. They created a community process that was more like the state fair than a yelling match. So there was mobile-friendly commenting and fun artist-designed activities, including a set in the future game show about trivia about Minneapolis in 2040. Those activities, those events always had free food. They invited everyone in Minneapolis to show up, and we did. Now, we had to do our part too, and this is where Neighbors for More Neighbors came in. There is widespread support for welcoming more people in Minneapolis. We made it our job to turn them out. The support in our city is more of a like, yeah, sure, of course we want to have enough homes to go around, than a, I totally want to show up and testify to the city council at City Hall kind of support. Supporters are often people whose voices are missing. They're young people, transplants, renters. We had to let people know why it was important to show up, that their voice mattered. And I will say the bulldozer sign people were kind of helpful here, and where and when and how to show up. We organized walk-in talks with our city council members. We hosted comment in a box parties. We wrote blog posts. We pitched our neighbors. We talked to the media. And we also got people out to testify at public hearings. There were stories in the local press about how there was more anti than pro feedback, and that's why we needed the last partner in this, the city council. Now, in 2017, organizing elected a progressive city council 1 year before the final Minneapolis 2040 vote. The council had 2 years of discussion and 9 months of conversation with constituents after seeing the stories from Mapping Prejudice, reading Wedge Live, and they do read Wedge Live, After joining neighbors, former neighbors on walk and talks, they understood why it was important to support this big, not perfect, but way better than the status quo plan. After just a year behind that big council dais, they knew that people opposing things show up and people supporting them don't. Yet with this plan, we showed up in support. They needed and saw community support. In the end, they voted 12-1 to pass Minneapolis 2040. Now, it wasn't easy and we're not done. Neighbors for More Neighbors is focused on holding the city accountable to implementing those zoning reforms, and we're supporting others in tracking progress on affordable housing and tenants' rights. Those ordinances are now passing. I challenged each of you to identify where you fit into addressing your region's housing shortage. We need to build affordable homes at every level so people who can afford more expensive homes aren't crowding lower wealth people out of communities. And you do too. If you want to see policy changes like we're passing in Minneapolis, you need to learn your own city's hidden history. You need to talk to your neighbors. You need to show up and tell your elected leaders that you want something different. I challenge you to give us in Minneapolis something even bigger to meet.
Thank you very much, Gianna, for telling the story of Minneapolis. And I think for me, the thing that stands out was making the invisible visible. And I think that applied to a couple of different things. On the one hand, it was, really diving into the racist history of community development in Minneapolis. The other side of it was, also making it known that there are people who are in support of what it is that you were trying to do. Another way you can think about this, making the invisible visible, is the personal stories of people who are going through different situations around housing. I mean, just the fact that, the woman with the young child who basically skipped a pretty important part in her development, because of the housing conditions. That's really, tough to hear, but that is the unfortunate reality that a lot of people are facing. So was there anything that you learned that you were not expecting?
Well, I was really surprised about the passion in the city in all sorts of different ways. I've been working on ensuring everybody had access to a home for 20 years in a variety of different ways. And it's always a sort of low-level drumbeat that people care about, but it's not usually something people are showing up for. And it was so heartening and exciting and wonderful to have literally hundreds of people showing up with me, alongside me in new ways, saying, I'm housing secure, but I want to make sure everybody in my city has a safe place to go home to. I want to make sure that we are addressing these disparities that we have created and maybe don't get to see every day because it's a different neighborhood far from where I live, or those kids don't go to school with my kids because we have segregated our city. And I want to make sure that we're living up to our city's values. So I think that for me was the biggest surprise, was just how many people really wanted to do something to create the city that they like to think they live in and are realizing that they don't quite live in yet.
Yeah, so that's, awesome. I do want to, bring in a few questions from our audience. So the first is, has there been a noticeable impact on housing affordability in Minneapolis since these changes have gone into place?
We are seeing some shifts in housing accessibility in Minneapolis. I want to put it in context. We have spent 50 years building our housing shortage, and it's going to take us a long time to catch up and have enough homes because the way we build our communities takes many, many years. Legalizing a triplex on a particular lot in the city doesn't mean anything happens tomorrow. My neighbor across the alley lives in a single family home on a piece of land that is legal to have a triplex, and he likes it there. He doesn't want to move. He's not going to sell his house. He's not going to tear his house down. He's not going to change it. And they're a pretty young family. I don't think they're likely to go anywhere for a long time, right? So when when you do that across a whole city, it takes a long time to see the changes that you want to see. That's why this is a 20-year plan. Another thing that's important to remember is this comprehensive plan was passed in December of 2018. That was the political passage. The formal official passage was in 2019. So it has been officially in place for less than a year. The zoning change that legalized triplexes on any lot in the city was passed earlier this year. So the changes themselves are pretty new. I offer that all up to say we have been working on this issue for many years. This is another piece of a host of dozens of different changes that need to happen. We are starting to see people building triplexes now in places they weren't building them before. And having built many thousands of homes every year for the last about 8 years, somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 6,000 homes a year, Minneapolis rents are dropping. So rents in May of 2020 for 2-bedroom apartments were 13% lower than they were in 2019. And the only reason we can come up with is that it's about building that new housing. Some people have said maybe it's COVID. Well, we happen to have the same data for the city of St. Paul. And the city of St. Paul is actually about 10 feet away from the city of Minneapolis. So it's the exact same region. Their rents aren't showing that kind of a drop. They haven't built those homes. And so we both experienced the same pandemic effect, but we're not seeing the same shift in our housing affordability. And the only difference that there is between those two cities is how many homes we're building.
So another question, did Minneapolis also change parking requirements to accommodate this new multifamily housing?
I'm really excited about this. I started my advocacy career as a transit advocate. I have never owned a car, and I'm always a little bit grumpy about being forced to pay for a place to store my car when I don't have anything to put in that space. So the short answer is yes, and the long answer is it's got many steps to it. So I always think about how do you make change, and I want to be really clear that Minneapolis 2040 is not where change started in Minneapolis. It is one of many steps. So we have a city council member, Lisa Bender, who was elected in 2013. And one of the things that she did pretty early in her first term was to work on shifting parking minimums. And so she shepherded a policy that reduced parking minimums near frequent transit, high frequency transit. Soon after that, we started to see a different kind of building being built in Minneapolis. And we saw two things. One is that the buildings felt like they belonged in the neighborhood a little bit better. So before parking reform, the apartment buildings that were getting built, and there were quite a few, and they were really important homes for thousands of people, but they didn't feel right when you walked past them in the neighborhood. They felt like they were out of scale somehow. It's a little bit hard to say how. The newer buildings felt like they were the right size. They tended to be much shorter to walk past. They still had parking for the most part, but they had a lot less parking. They tended to have a parking ratio of, I don't know, one half parking space per apartment, something like that. The other thing that we saw is that their rents were much lower. That reducing of parking requirements meant that the buildings fit in the neighborhood better. They were more affordable as a rule. Now that didn't eliminate parking minimums. In 2040, we do say that we will eliminate parking minimums citywide. And again, I want to repeat, eliminating those parking minimums didn't mean people weren't building parking. It just meant they were building less parking. We are still building parking, and we will continue to have parking in new developments in our city. But the people building it get to figure out how much do we really need. And then the people living there won't have to subsidize so many empty parking spaces.
So with that, I'll hand it back over to Rashmi, and we'll transition to our larger panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Wendell, and thank you so much to George and Yana as well. As each of you was speaking, I was thinking about the extraordinary importance of a community process, an inclusive community process that each of you emphasized. And I'm wondering if you could turn it into, a slogan or two that you would share with us. What would you describe as best practices for just pulling together that kind of process? for a community that is maybe viewing itself as just embarking on the path of doing that?
Well, I think one thing I would say is, one slogan I would point out is that if you just hold an event as part of a community process, and you look around at the group of people in the room, the one thing I can guarantee you is you don't have all the right people in the room. And one of the things we've actually started doing with each of our neighborhood planning efforts is pull together a diverse group of people in what we call our crowdsourcing session, and spend the first meeting just talking about who's not in the room and how we get them in the room before we actually do any planning work, because a lot of our problems occur with this circumstance whereby the people in the room make the decision, and then you go out and share it with everybody else, and you find you've left out renters, you've left out people of color, you've left out huge portions of the constituency that is represented in your community.
Design process to counteract historic power imbalances. So in Minneapolis, the planners started by saying, we know who is missing. And so they waited to engage the people who usually show up, the people who, George, I think you're talking about being in that room, until after they had framed up the plan with those folks who mostly aren't comfortable, safe, invited, welcome in those rooms. And they did incredible work to make safer spaces, predictable spaces, and to honor the input from those folks before they engaged wealthier, whiter homeowners and people like me. And I think that is absolutely critical. If you don't acknowledge power imbalances when you're designing engagement and design to counteract what you know is going to happen, what has always happened in every community in the United States, you're going to get the same result, and you're not going to be able to overcome the continuing imbalance in political influence in local processes.
We've received more questions than we're going to be able to address. But here's the question that I want to ask by way of follow-up, and it's from someone who has read Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and talks about how the author points to self-interest as the obstacle to eliminating policy that maintains exclusion. The question the person poses is I think, so apt. Would you recommend considering a self-shaming strategy?
I think about what will create the change that reduces harm the most. So I'm a pragmatic person, because every day we don't build more homes, there are people who are pushed out of their homes and onto the streets. And so what I want to center is always those folks and think about what is the strategy that gets the most people home stability the fastest and keeps us headed in the right direction. And white fragility is a really powerful thing. So figuring out the right way to dance around political power of people who are maybe feeling shame and not yet able to admit that publicly, or who are really wrestling with things that are new to them, when you're also needing to center that there are people who for hundreds and hundreds of years, they and their ancestors have been pushed to the side and pushed out, that's a really difficult thing. So that map that shows where those red signs are and how that's not representative of the city, some people were really angry about that map and felt personally attacked by that. Many other people said, I didn't realize that was what was going on, and started to show up. It gave them the freedom to show up. So we use that to help people notice things, and then we gave them an outlet to be who they like to think that they are and fight for a different future. That worked for us. But the political context is different in every city and every year. And I really hope that 2 years from now and 5 years from now, we don't have to ask this question about self-shaming.
So thank you so much. We are basically completely out of time. So the themes that I would most emphasize in anticipation of that next conversation are the articulation of the range of groups, which almost we could have taken verbatim from both Yana and George in developing a highly inclusive process. The value of transparency in that process, of the sharing of a history, in particular of racism, and of using that history as a way of being explicit about the goals that were important to the particular community in developing housing affordability, but also addressing the other intertwined goals and needs that were felt by that community. So that George's articulation of the group, the neighbors' efforts to have an explicit discussion of equity, and Yana's description of the ways in which neighbors became involved right from the beginning and then continued in holding the city accountable were such powerful examples of that. And then the importance of incorporating all of those groups in an active process of visioning seemed so relevant here. And finally, two other pieces really rose to the surface for me in these conversations. One is just the idea of neighbors as the units of action. And then the second is the articulation of goals and values through the process of changing the zoning for the particular area. So I'll leave the discussion of themes at that. And then I'll say that the very next step in Forum 3 is a visioning process. So we hope that, that those of you who have been here today can join us again in the third forum. Certainly the forum organizers understand that it's going to take more beyond visioning, but at least in that next step of our process together, the hope is to come together, use Zoom technology to break up into chat rooms and really roll up our sleeves and talk about how to bridge that gap between our progressive values and still the imperfect reality that, at least in Brookline, we continue to experience. So with that, thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you to the panelists and to our moderator, Wendell, for their participation. Stay tuned and have a good afternoon.